Okay, K1. So this is our first Thanksgiving book in our series of books that I'm going to be reading to you. It is Tuesday, and you are going to watch this video of me reading this Thanksgiving story, and then you are going to complete the prompt on the journal paper that I gave you. So if you're a kindergartner, I need you to pay attention and look for the pictures within the story and what the story is telling you. You're going to need to draw and color a picture to match. If you'd like to challenge yourself and write a sentence about the book, that'd be awesome. First grade, however, we're used to writing sentences, so you're going to do the same thing and draw and color a picture to match this story, but you're also going to write me 3 sentences about the story. Maybe it's something you learned, maybe it's something you heard. Let's get started. This is called The Story of the Pilgrims by Catherine Ross. She's the author. And it's illustrated, we can tell, because these are not photographs, these are pictures, by Carolyn Kroll. The Story of the Pilgrims. Once upon a time in the land of England, there lived a small group of people called Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were unhappy because the King of England would not let them worship God in their own way. So the Pilgrims packed up their belongings and said a tearful goodbye to their homes and their friends and the world they knew. On a mild day in autumn, they set sail for a new world called America. That's our country, which was across the wide ocean for them. Other families came along, and together they hoped to find freedom and a better life. More than 100 people squeezed into a small wooden sailing ship called the Mayflower. 22 of those pilgrims were children, just like you. For their journey, they brought with them only the simplest foods, things like hard cheese, bread, dried beans, and salted meat, or things that would stay preserved. Day after day, the Pilgrims saw nothing but endless ocean and sky. Now and then, a huge slippery body of a whale would break the surface of the water. On and on they sailed through calm days and stormy ones, until after 66 days at sea, they heard the words they had been dreaming of for so long. Land ho! Which means that they see land. Nearer and nearer to the land they sailed until the water was so shallow they could go no farther. They dropped anchor in a peaceful bowl-shaped harbor rimmed with sparkling white sand. Dense woods rose up all around. There were no towns and no houses. There was no sign of any people at all. The Pilgrims rowed ashore to explore this wild land so full of mystery and promise. The men were armed with guns. They had heard that America was full of fierce people called Native Americans. After many days of exploring up and down the coast, they found a deep harbor near good farmland. Here they would make their home, and they called it Plymouth. While some stood guard against the Native Americans, others began to build houses. The first was long and low and very plain. They called it the common house, which they would all share. As each day grew colder and darker, they worked quickly because winter was coming. And a terrible winter it was. There were dark days of bleak and bitter cold, far colder than any they had known back in England. Snow and sleet and high winds battered the common house, and the little ship anchored in the harbor. The Pilgrims huddled together for warmth, trying to survive on stale food from their long voyage. Many of them became sick and died. By the time spring came, there were only 50 pilgrims left alive, and most of them were children. What would they do if the Native Americans attacked? Surely they would be too weak to fight back. Then one day a Native American did come, and the Pilgrims had never seen one so close. They were so scared of these new people. But this Native American had come in peace, and his name was Samoset. So they weren't scary at all. A few days later, more Native Americans marched to their village, 60 of them, led by a warrior chief. The Pilgrims and the Native Americans made a treaty, or a promise, to not do each other any harm, but to help one another. One Native American named Squanto turned out to be their special friend. He taught the Pilgrims many things, like where to find the best fish, and how to stamp out eels in the mud at low tide, or how to find their way safely through the dark forest, and the best places to find nuts, berries, and wild herbs to eat. That was super nice of him, right? And Squanto taught the Pilgrims how to plant a wonderful new food. It was called corn, and in each seed mound they buried a small fish to help the corn grow. All that first summer in the New World, the Pilgrims fished and hunted and tended to their crops. They built more houses to live in and sheds to store their supplies. The children worked and explored and played with their few simple toys. When autumn came, the Pilgrims rejoiced over their harvest. Remember, we talked about harvest. Harvest is when you're gathering all those crops that you've been growing together to eat. It was bright ears of corn and fat pumpkins, peas, beans, delicious squash, and green herbs. They felt so happy about their good fortune that they wanted to celebrate. They knew they could never have survived without the Native Americans, so they invited the Native Americans to join them in a big feast. 90 Native Americans came. And for 3 days and nights, the Pilgrims and the Native Americans ate and drank and danced and played games together. To remember that time so long ago, a time of brave Pilgrims and life-saving Native Americans, we continue to celebrate this feast today. And we call it Thanksgiving. So I hope that this history lesson told you a little bit about the Pilgrims and the Native Americans. Obviously, the Pilgrims were people called settlers, and they came over to what they thought was a brand new world. But in reality, the Native Americans had been here for a really long time and had been living in their own way. So it's really cool. This is just our first of our story series, but go ahead and do your write-up about it. The end.